Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today I just wanted to get a rather short episode compared to the other episodes that we've done for Chee-Tash. This is an episode that was kind of inspired by a shift in my thinking over the past year or two, that I'm trying to be more honest with myself and be more open-minded about just things in life. There's multiple sides to every story. And I feel like in my life I get caught up sometimes in just one thing that I forget that there's other ways of going about telling a story. For example, I got I got so into weightlifting that you know that's all I was doing, and I was neglecting running and stretching and flexibility. Well, it takes a balance of all three of those to make a good athlete. You don't want to be so strong but be super tight or slow. Even as an offensive lineman, you have to have some athleticism to do that. It's kind of like what we talked about with winning in mind. There's a balance between the self-image, conscious mind, and subconscious mind. You don't want any of those three areas, one to get too big in proportion to the others. So I sometimes have to remind myself of that and just kind of be honest and constantly challenging myself. Like, hey, is this right? What are the benefits? What are the downsides of this? What other viewpoints do people have about it? Is it the main consensus opinion, or is there other opinions about it? So, going through reading the bell curve right now, and if you guys remember chapter 3, we were talking about IQ as and its effect on job performance. And, Dr. Murray and Herrnstein go into details on how the evidence that they saw from a particular scientist, Hunter and Hunter, Schmidt and Hunter, in the 1980s, doing a meta-analysis of data from armed forces qualifications testing, which is basically like IQ testing, and then data from the NLSY, that yes, it seems like IQ has a very big effect, specifically like the G factor, on your performance in your job, and how we are potentially losing out on money every year from hiring people who are not good at their jobs, or hiring people based on not on their IQs but on other factors, which according to the studies that they've done and they've looked at, don't have as big of an impact as if you were to give somebody an IQ test. But again, if you guys remember, there was a Supreme Court case that made it unconstitutional or illegal to hire based on an IQ test, unless that IQ test was testing out specific job functionalities, like just specific things pertaining to the job. I came across this study here, Does IQ Really Predict Job Performance? By Ken Richardson and Sarah Norgate. This is relatively recent, 2015, and this again goes back to my thinking, like, hey, what's the other side of this? What are people saying that disagree with this? Is there a disagreement in this? And it certainly seems like there is, and this is kind of just one thing to consider. You don't want to just look at the viewpoint of the book, The Bell Curve, but let's get the whole picture here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And there's people who beg to differ as far as, does IQ really predict job performance? And I will say, from reading, browsing through this study, it's not that they're saying that it's there's no correlation at all, but just that specifically the studies of Hunter that Hunter completed in the 70s, 80s, and a little bit in the 90s as well, they just have some criticisms on those studies and saying that the correlations were not really as high as Hunter reported them to be, based on the fact that Hunter made some corrections to his studies. Hunter's studies were also meta-analyses, which there can be some downsides to, which they discuss in this paper. Primarily, though, Ken Richardson and Sarah Norgate talk about really three things that Hunter failed to take into account. There was a sampling error, unreliability of measure instruments, and then the restriction of range. As well as they talk about how, meta-analysis is a great tool, but it often mixes apples with oranges. Here, if I can go to this other article I just kind of pulled up, some key limitations and potential solutions, meta-analysis. So this kind of says it here, heterogeneity. Combining apples and oranges has been commonly used as a metaphor to describe the problem of pooling studies that are dissimilar in some ways. The potential to ignore important differences between studies can invalidate meta-analysis. Some feel that meta-analysis should not even be the ultimate goal of a systematic review. Pooling may not be appropriate if effects are not robust or consistent across studies. So what this is saying is that, yes, meta-analysis can be a good thing, but if you're pooling together studies that are just too different in what they're measuring, too different in what the experiment is, you're not going to really have a good meta-analysis. And that kind of makes sense. You want something to be similar when you're trying to test if the results are what you think they're going to be. You want to repeat the experiment in almost like the exact same way that another group did, because you're checking over, hey, I used the exact same procedures as they did and I got a different result. Well, why is that? Did I do something wrong? And that's where you just continually experiment and refine it. So this article talks about some other points about meta-analysis. It's mentioned poor quality of included studies. A well-done meta-analysis of badly designed studies will yield invalid results. Bias and confounding in the primary studies are major problems for meta-analysis. Notably, issues of randomization and blinding in clinical trials. So just some things to take into account. That's some downsides to a meta-analysis. Let's go to just some of these, the corrections for sampling error here. And let's just read from here. Sampling error arises. This again is from the article, Does IQ Really Predict Job Performance? And again, they look at three things, the first one being sampling error. So first, sampling error arises because the observed correlations are being estimated from subsamples of the general population as well as subsamples of the universe of jobs. The correlations that is will deviate from the unknown population correlation by an unknown degree, affecting the overall as well as its confidence intervals. The mean of the observed correlations, as used in meta-analysis, will also have an inflated variance. Therefore, the sampling error variance has to be subtracted from the overall variance. So very interesting. A number of issues surround corrections for sampling errors. The Schmidt and Hunter approach assumes that all specific study samples are from essentially the same reference population, which we know to not necessarily be the. And this was a question that I had about the Hunter studies, was that some of them heavily relied on armed forces, on the military. Well, that's like a particular subset of the population, and Murray introduced this concept of the restriction of range. But isn't the armed forces kind of restricting that range too? These are going to be people that are slightly different than the general population. I mean, wouldn't we kind of assume that? Because not everybody's going to join the military, right? So assumes that all specific study samples are from essentially the same reference population with single underlying IQ job performance correlation having close to zero variance. And we continue on. Rather than being carefully planned as random designs, particular studies are conducted on an as available basis. After all, recruitment of participants is based on finding an employer willing to have employees tested, finding supervisors willing to rate them, which will be more likely to occur with some jobs than others. So basically what they're saying is that there's the approach that Schmidt and Hunter are taking here. There's going to be differences from the sample in the study and then the general population is kind of what they're saying with this. However, the reliabilities of the measures actually used in the meta-analyses in question were only sporadically available. They recommended basing them on the subset of the studies for which information happened to be available. Using that strategy, Schmidt and Hunter arrived at a reliability of 0.60 for job performance. And as Hartigan and Wiegder explained, this figure has met with some skepticism. Many believe that 0.60 value is too low. And they're saying that this reliability index used by Schmidt and Hunter was used to increase the estimate of the population correlation by 30%. So they corrected, from correcting their results, the correlation increased for them between like IQ and job performance. So that's for the sampling error. Let's go to measure. Oh, that was measurement error, talking about the 0.60. Okay, I got a little ahead of myself. Right. So yeah, for the measurement error, they're basing it off the 0.6 number, which people think it's too low. Some people, I believe earlier in the article, were mentioning that a more appropriate reliability index would have been 0.8. Let's continue. Correct. Continue on here. Most individuals create a difference between their maximum and their typical performances such that these indices are not highly correlated and have different correlates. Stewart and Nandokiolar found that intra-individual variation was greater than inter-individual variation in job performance. Again, correction becomes to some extent guesswork. So intra-individual, so that probably means comparing one individual to himself at a different period of time or under different circumstances, rather than inter-individual, which is comparing two different people and their job performance results, I guess, so to speak. This was a good one. Meta-analytic research is sometimes cavalier in its treatment of construct-related issues. In particular, there's sometimes an apparent assumption that superficially similar studies, or those that claim to be dealing with the same set of constructs, can be easily combined to draw meaningful construct-level inferences. This is not true. Rather, careful thought needs to go into decisions about how to link study outcomes with constructs. So again, goes back to this whole thing about is meta-analysis appropriate in this, and are you doing a good job of selecting studies for your meta-analysis that are apples to apples, basically. The last thing the authors talk about here in regards to the linking job IQ with job performance is the one thing they question is this range restriction, which again goes back to what we were talking about last time regarding NFL tackles and how there's not a correlation between weight and in how well an NFL tackle performs in the NFL. You could have the lightest tackle in the NFL be a Pro Bowler, an All-Pro. But if you take that data into account, you're not going to go to the lightest guy in your locker room and say, hey, we're going to make you one of our left tackle for this season. And the lightest guy in your locker room is 150 pounds. You wouldn't do that. So this was another problem that they stated regarding the IQ tests, the IQ studies with Hunter. Third common problem is that sample correlations may vary because of range restriction in the samples. Main reason it arises is that job performance ratings can only be provided for those who are actually in the job, having been IQ tested, not for all possible workers. An unmeasured complication is that those who might even apply for a job will be self-selecting to some extent, reflecting self-perceptions of a variety of other attributes. So what they're saying, and such as experience, ability, self-confidence, experience, paper qualifications, so on. This was something that it's just common sense to me. Some people, don't you think some people might be smarter than you, but they're not as confident that they're as smart as you, right? And again, let's take this back to with winning in mind. Your self-image is going to either limit you or enable you to utilize your whole skill set, right? This is kind of like directly related. Yes, you could be really smart. Your subconscious circle is off the charts, but you don't have that confidence in you. You're probably not going to perform well on an IQ test. Is that going to be the best way to measure the correlation between IQ and job performance, right? In the measures of job performance, is it going to be a supervisor rating? Is it going to be a written test of your abilities pertaining to that job or knowledge on that job? Or is it going to be the work, the actual legit work that you put in at that job? Remember, there was those three ways that Charles Murray, Dr. Herrnstein talked about in Chapter 3. They used those three tools to measure job performance. So let's continue on here. The main problem is that of identifying the variance for the appropriate reference population in the present case. The true reference population is all applicants for a job, all of which should have been IQ tested. However, the standard deviation of the observed job applicants' test results is rarely available, so the strategy has been to deduce it from that of actual workers' scores, the only ones available. In the Schmidt and Hunter methods, it is simply assumed that the reference population could be represented by the entire U.S. workforce, which could in turn be adequately represented by the 515 jobs in the GATB database. This was one of the databases that was used. Remember the validity of GATB to predictive job success? Let's continue on. Self-sorting. Those are the main arguments. Some of the other things that were brought up by these authors in this article were that it's seemingly from the meta-analysis that Hunter put together, a lot of it comes from like 1920s to the 1970s. Actually, I think that's right here. but they're subject to the same objections for those for job performance. The raw correlations are very low. The most quoted results are from training in the forces personnel, whereas all meta-analyses include dozens of different tests of varying psychometric standards and many very old studies dating as far back as the 1920s. So that's the thing is Hunter takes he uses in his meta-analysis a lot of studies that are a lot older. All right, and even let's be honest, the bell curve is over, what is it now, 25 years old. So do you think that there's, other more recent studies that can maybe corroborate what the authors are trying to say? Like, I'm talking like 2010, 2020, etc. That's what I would be curious on, is seeing if there's any recent studies that can corroborate this. Something else that they talked about was if they didn't think that Hunter took into account the Flynn effect, which I have pulled up here. The Flynn effect is the substantial and log-sustained increase in both fluid and crystallized intelligence test scores that were measured in many parts of the world over the 20th century. So that's kind of interesting. By convention, the average of the test results is set. Test scores have been continuous, approximately linear from the earliest years of testing to the present. Average scores rose by 14 IQ points, British children from 1942 to 2008. And Flynn, they're saying that this has to do with changes in maybe diet, nutrition, possibly just like mating, and higher IQ people tend to marry other IQ people and then producing other high IQ children. So look here, generally more stimulating environment. Okay, well, yeah, maybe. Like I said, nutrition, of getting more of your vitamins and minerals, infectious diseases, heterosis, but they're basically saying that Hunter kind of failed to take this into account, or even like talk about it in his studies. We mentioned older studies, also with measuring job performance and IQ. They did talk about supervisors' ratings and how that could be problematic. That could potentially be unfairly biased, as some supervisors might not like you even if you are good at your job or are smart. They might give you bad ratings. So the main goal of this video is just to point out, like, hey, let's not take anything here as gospel. I like Charles Murray, and I've seen some of his interviews, and he's got some interesting work, but there are two sides to every coin, and we should take a look at that. We shouldn't be afraid of these ideas that, hey, there's other studies that say, hey, IQ is not nearly as predictive of job performance as we kind of are saying in this book. Guys, let me know what you think if you made it this far. Thank you so much for listening. Next week, we will have a video on With Winning in Mind. We'll get another video up of that, and then continue on with the bell curve. My name is Chris. Thank you all so much. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.